Superflex fantasy football leagues allow you to start up to 2 quarterbacks in your lineup every single week, and these types of leagues are exploding with popularity in fantasy football circles year over year. Finally, we are seeing the most important position in all of professional sports become the most important position in all of fantasy football. In fact, one of my subscribers in my fantasy football Discord server, Ada Baby Eats a Boy, is doing his first ever Superflex league here in 2024, and he recently asked me and everybody else in the Discord server, how does Superflex strategy compare and how does it differ to what we're used to in typical one quarterback fantasy football leagues? So today, in episode 33 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, let's not just talk about strategy. Let's do a full-blown mock draft using Ada Baby Eats a Boy's league settings, because that's the type of support you get when you're a Basement Brewed Fantasy Football subscriber. What's up, my friend? It's me, Mikey, from Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. And today, in episode 33, we're going to do a Superflex mock draft using the league settings of one of my subscribers from my fantasy football Discord server. His name is Ada Baby Eats a Boy. Now, his league is a 10-team league, which is already different than the mocks that we did in episode 29, episode 30, and episode 31, and it also changes the overall strategy of a fantasy football draft regardless of if it's a super flex league or a one quarterback league. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. This is going to be a PPR scoring type of league where they start one quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, which is different than what we've done, 1 tight end, 1 super flex where you can start a quarterback, and 2 flex spots where you can start a running back, a tight end, or a wide receiver. And then there's 6 bench spots, making a grand total of 15 rounds that we're going to go through today. Now, Ada Baby Eats a Boy specifically asked me to mock from the 4 spot, as that's where he thinks he is going to be drafting. They do a series of lawn games, or like a lawn Olympics, to determine the draft order, and he suspects he's going to land somewhere around the 4 spot, so that's where we're going to mock from in today's episode. Now, before we dive into the mock draft itself, let's talk about the overall philosophy and the overall strategy going into this draft. Now, for starters, a 10-team league doing a 15-round draft instantly changes the fantasy football landscape when it's compared to a 12-team league doing a 15-round draft. There's literally going to be 30 less drafted players in this league, and that means a couple of different things. For starters, less teams and less roster spots creates a very shallow league and a very heavy waiver wire pool, meaning it's going to be a heck of a lot easier in a 10-team league than in a 12-team league to find running backs on the waiver wire when injuries strike that you can plug and play and put into your lineup in any given week. It also makes it a heck of a lot easier to stream the tight end position because you have less teams hogging tight ends at fantasy's thinnest position. It's much easier to fill those holes at running back and at tight end than it would be in a 12-team league. Now, if you paid attention to episodes 29, 30, and 31, then you're already well aware that I am all about hammering wide receivers early in 2024 fantasy football. It's just the way that the fantasy football landscape seems to shake out in 2024 fantasy football drafts. And in a league like this, where we only have 10 teams, there's only 15 roster spots, and I can feel all but certain that the waiver wire pool is going to be chock full of plug-and-play running backs and tight ends, I am even more likely in a league like this to emphasize and hammer wide receivers and scoop up tight ends, scoop up running backs a little bit later. Now, this league does only start 2 wide receivers as opposed to 3 wide receivers, which we've been doing in those recent episodes. So theoretically, that does lessen the need, it lessens the demand for high quality wide receivers, But this league does also start 2 flex spots instead of just 1, meaning we can still fit 4 wide receivers into our 9-player lineup, which makes up about 44% of our starting lineup in a PPR league. Now, in a Superflex league, because you can and you should start 2 quarterbacks every single week, they should absolutely be the priority in your fantasy football draft, and you will see them fly off the draft boards as soon as the very first pick begins. You're going to see Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, all of those guys go in the first several picks of 2024 Superflex drafts. Now, for me, when I'm doing a Superflex draft, my hope is to walk out of that draft with 2 quarterbacks that I consider to be every week starters. Though I do want to emphasize not forcing it, not forcing any strategy, not forcing yourself to grab a quarterback if it means leaving a ton of value on the table at running back or at wide receiver, which is one of the biggest mistakes I see fantasy football players make when they're doing their first Superflex draft. They panic and they reach for second-tier quarterbacks when they have an opportunity to grab top-tier running backs and top-tier wide receivers. So while I want to walk out of the draft with 2 every-week starters at quarterback, I do want to emphasize, do not force it. Do not force yourself to panic draft a quarterback because you think they're flying off the board. Now, for me, the guys that I consider to be every-week starters tends to end right about here, right about after the Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy tier. Brock Purdy is about the cutoff for me as it pertains to quarterbacks I consider to be every single week starters. Guys that if you're on your roster, they will be in your lineup. You don't have to play matchups, you don't have to think about it, you don't have to stream them. As opposed to somebody later in the draft, like a Matthew Stafford. He's a great high-quality quarterback, but he's not necessarily a guy that you want in your lineup every single week. So for me, I want to get 2 of these guys from Brock Purdy and above. And if I do get 2 of these guys, I'm not even wasting another draft pick or another roster spot on another quarterback. I'm not going to waste a roster spot on a guy where I'm simply waiting for bye weeks to use that player. And that's another one of the mistakes that I think you'll see a lot of fantasy football players make in a Superflex draft is the inherent, they feel a need to draft a third quarterback so that they can plug the holes when bye weeks start to roll around and they need a second quarterback because QB1 and QB2 are on bye week. For me, if I get 2 of those guys, I want to draft like you're right, which is something we talk about in my Discord server all of the time. And what that means is assume those top 2 quarterbacks that I drafted are going to be in my lineup every single week, meaning that a third quarterback would be a complete waste of roster space outside of 1 or 2 bye weeks. So for me, I would rather use that roster space on another high-quality running back or another high-quality wide receiver that very well could find his way into my lineup on a standalone basis when injuries strike or when bye weeks roll around. Now, if I don't get 2 of those top tier every week starters at quarterback, that's okay. Because there are a lot of high quality late round quarterbacks that we can just target later. Guys like Matthew Stafford or Kirk Cousins or Aaron Rodgers or Deshaun Watson. Instead, if I don't get 2 of those every week starters, I want to spend my draft picks stockpiling talent at running back, stockpiling talent at wide receiver, all the while letting the other 9 opponents in my league panic, draft, and reach for mid-tier quarterbacks, leaving plenty of value on the table for me to soak up in my draft. Now, if I miss out on those every week, guys, if I miss out on those every week starters, my goal is likely to draft 3 quarterbacks and then stream them or play matchups every single week using my weekly fantasy football heat map, which I'm sure we're going to talk about plenty in today's episode. Ultimately, the overall key to dominating a Superflex fantasy football draft is to be able to prioritize quarterback while not sacrificing value at other positions, which is the mistake that fantasy football players make when they're doing a Superflex fantasy football draft. Now, don't force any one specific strategy, don't force any one specific roster construction, but generally speaking, I would want to walk out of this specific draft with anywhere between 2 and 3 quarterbacks, depending on when those first 2 quarterbacks were drafted, 5 to 7 running backs, depending on where the first 1 or 2 running backs were drafted, 5 to 7 wide receivers, depending on where the first 3 or 4 wide receivers were drafted, and 1 tight end. And that tight end is either going to be a guy that we drafted early that we're going to plug into our lineup every single week, regardless of matchup, or it's going to be a guy that we drafted late, and we're just going to stream tight ends all year using Basement Brood Fantasy Football's weekly heat map, which again, I'm sure we'll talk about plenty. So let's kick off this mock draft. Again, we're going to be drafting from the number 4 spot in a 10-team PPR Superflex draft, and this one's for you, Otta Baby Eats a Boy. Now, the 4 spot in this particular Superflex is a terrific, terrific place to be because it guarantees you a top-tier, Tier 1 quarterback. You're going to just take whoever's left between Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Lamar Jackson. Now, if we were a little bit deeper in the draft, even 5, 6, 7, 8, then those top 4 quarterbacks are likely to be off the board, and there would be a case, an argument to be made to pivot away from quarterback, to look at Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase. But in this case, the 4 spot guarantees you a top-tier quarterback, and there's no reason to really even look elsewhere. So, without further ado, let's get this thing going and see what happens. So this thing started with an absolute surprise. CeeDee Lamb going first overall, followed by Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and leaving me with no decision at all. This is a pretty easy pick. I currently have Patrick Mahomes ranked as my number 1 quarterback in 2024 fantasy football leagues. He's on the board. He's available. Easy decision here. Don't even have to think twice about this one. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master, or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. I wish this was a real draft. Otta Baby Eats a Boy, if you can walk out of the 4th pick, the 4th pick in the first round of your upcoming draft with Patrick Mahomes, congratulations. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's a perennial stud. He's still got Travis Kelce. Rashee Rice, there's no real suspension in sight, at least seemingly so far. They went and got Marquise Brown. Xavier Worthy looks like an absolute animal. Patrick Mahomes is going to light it up this year. He's my easy QB1 this year ahead of Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. But even if you don't get him 4th overall, you're going to walk out with Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, or Lamar Jackson. Can't go wrong. Now, after I took Patrick Mahomes 4th overall, which is still wild to me, it went Christian McCaffrey, Lamar Jackson, Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, CJ Stroud, and Jamar Chase to finish up round 1. And then round 2 went Breece Hall, A.J. Brown, Anthony Richardson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Bijan Robinson, and Joe Burrow. Unfortunately, Joe Burrow was the guy that I was hoping we would see here in the 2nd round. I think he's a sneaky bet to win the MVP award this year. Now, this is a scenario where if one of my top tier players in my draft guide was still available, if Bijan Robinson, if Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, if one of those guys were available in this spot, I would 100% be considering them instead of a quarterback in this spot. But there's nobody left in those top 2 tiers of my fantasy football draft guide. We are now in tier 3, the best players available, which are great players, but the best players available are Garrett Wilson, Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua. I'm fine with all of those guys, but it's also entirely likely that I'm going to get one or more of those guys in my upcoming picks. So, because we still have some of those difference makers, some of those every week quarterbacks that I was talking about earlier in the episode, because several of them are still available between Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, and Brock Purdy, I am going to use this pick on either Dak Prescott or Kyler Murray. This is more of a coin flip They're both in the same tier in my fantasy football draft guide. Let's just go ahead and take the best available. Dak Prescott, if you tuned into my Dallas Cowboys episode, I raved all about Dak Prescott, how I think he's a dark horse to win the MVP award this year. He was on an absolute tear down the stretch in 2024 fantasy football leagues last year. Let's scoop up Dak to go with Patrick Mahomes, and we are literally done drafting quarterbacks for the entire rest of this draft. We are back on the clock with the fourth pick in the third round. Our first pick was two-time MVP Patrick Mahomes, a guy who's finished as a top 8 fantasy quarterback in all 6 years that he's been a starting quarterback, including 4 top 4 finishes, 2 top 1 finishes. And then in the second round, we went ahead and got Dak Prescott, a guy who averaged 24 fantasy points per game over the last 13 games last season, finishing on an absolute tear. So here we are in round 3, and now at this point, we are literally going to ignore the quarterback position the entire rest of this draft, and now we are just going to treat it as a typical 10-team PPR draft that starts 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 2 flex. Now, my 2024 fantasy football draft guide has been updated to reflect our current state of affairs, right? We are in the draft spot number 4. It's a 10-team league. This is pick 24 overall. And over on the right side of my draft guide, there's a handy-dandy upcoming picks tracker that shows you exactly which number you're going to be picking from, which is super helpful because the draft guide also comes with frequently updated ADP that shows you where each player is usually drafted, which helps you understand where you can plan or budget for a guy to be in future rounds. Now, in the best remaining tier of my 2024 draft guide, we have 2 options. We have Jonathan Taylor and we have Cooper Kupp. Now, you'll see Jonathan Taylor usually goes around pick 11 overall. Granted, this is for 1 quarterback leagues. It's not a Superflex draft guide. But he has an overall ADP of 11, while Cooper Kupp has an ADP of 37. And we still have another pick coming up around pick 37. And again, this isn't a Superflex league, so Cooper Kupp is more than likely going to be available to us in the 4th round. So if we have an opportunity here to take Jonathan Taylor and then also get Cooper Kupp in the next round of our fantasy football draft. And even if we don't, it's okay because we're going to be looking at a whole slew of wide receivers in that upcoming round. So right now, it's a pretty easy decision. We're going to be taking Jonathan Taylor off the board with our 3rd pick, the 4th pick in the 3rd round, and we've officially got our number 1 RB for the season. Inside my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, I've not only tiered and ranked every single player in fantasy football for easy decisions, but I've also included contextual 2024 previews detailing what to expect from every single player on every single team, not just the Detroit Lions. I've also included an interactive ADP tracker that suggests the perfect time to draft the player that you're targeting. This is one of many league-wrecking resources that 300 plus Basement Brood fantasy football customers are using to outsmart their friends, dominate their leagues, take down DFS contests, and cash in on NFL bets in 2024 and beyond. Hopefully me taking an early running back throws a little bit of water on the fire that I caught from all the haters in my recent episodes where I went wide receiver heavy, man. They just, on TikTok and Facebook, they could not fathom the idea of going wide receiver heavy and filling out running backs later. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that proves one of the biggest misunderstandings there, I think, from that short and from that TikTok is people thought I was saying you have to go into your draft and only draft wide receivers in the first 4 rounds, and that's quite frankly not the case. I've done over 300 best ball drafts on drafters.com now, and so many of my builds have at least 1 running back in the first 4 rounds, whether it's a guy like Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson. I've taken some Gibbs, I've taken some Jonathan Taylor, a little bit of Saquon Barkley, plenty of Derrick Henry. I mean, nobody is banging the table harder for Derrick Henry than I am in 2024. My point of that whole episode was just saying, hey, if you get through the first 4 rounds and you don't have a running back yet, don't freak out. Don't panic. It's going to be okay. There's a lot of serviceable running backs between rounds 5 and 8. But all that being said, now we are back on the clock, 7th pick, 4th round. So this is what, pick 37? And we already have both of our quarterbacks. We have a guy who RB1 is within his range of outcomes in Jonathan Taylor. And looking at Basement Brood Fantasy Football's draft guide, my draft guide, there's not really any running backs left that catch our attention. Instead, as you can see, we are about to be swimming in a sea of wide receivers that make my mouth water, that make me want to drool. We are in the 4th round, and by the way, the best players available in my draft guide, Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, Jalen Waddle, etc. These are guys that usually go in the 2nd round of competitive best ball drafts over on drafters.com, and now we basically have our pick of any of them, likely more than one of them. So this is where things are going to get a little bit interesting, however. The best available player on my board in a tier of his own is Cooper Kupp. So it's appetizing to just grab Cooper Kupp here. However, when you pay attention to Sleeper's ADP, which is where we're doing this mock draft on Sleeper, when you scroll down, you will see that Cooper Kupp is all the way down near 55. His ADP is around 55 in a Superflex draft, meaning there's a good chance he's going to be available 3 picks from now at pick 57. That's why it's really important to pay attention to the ADP of the platform that you're playing on. And Ottababy Eats a Boy told me that his draft is going to be on Yahoo. So Ottababy, if you're going to focus on Cooper Kupp in your draft, pay attention to where his ADP is on Yahoo. Now understand, that's Yahoo's public ADP. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where your opponents are going to take him. If you know your opponents, if you're friends with your opponents, you know whose draft guides they like to use, whose cheat sheets, whose rankings, the teams that they're a fan of, and you think it's possible Cooper Kupp won't slip, make your move. But in this case, we know that there's a pretty strong chance that Cooper Kupp is not only going to be available with our next pick, but in the 6th round. So we're going to skip on Cooper Kupp and target him later. That makes the next best available player in my list Deebo Samuel, and he's in a tier of his own, in tier 4. However, once again, looking at Sleeper's ADP, Deebo Samuel's way down here near Cooper Kupp at pick 55. So he could potentially be available in the 6th round. So we're going to wait on him. The next best available in my draft guide is Jalen Waddle. Now, when you look at Jalen Waddle, there's a possibility he's going to be available with the next pick. But ideally, I walk out of this draft with all 3 of those guys, right? So right now, it's going to make sense for me to take Jalen Waddle, who has a higher ADP on Sleeper, making him at least a little bit more likely. It's a little bit more of a risk that somebody will take Jalen Waddle than it will be that they take Deebo Samuel or Cooper Kupp according to this ADP. So we're going to take Jalen Waddle here. We're going to hope to see Cooper Kupp and or Deebo Samuel on the way back, and then we're going to hope to see whoever's left in the 6th round. And if not, we'll see where to go from there. But for now, we're going with Mr. Jalen Waddle. If you follow me on LinkedIn, then you know I have had one heck of a week. My business is on fire, in a bad way, not in a good way. So the other day, right here in the middle of fantasy draft season, the most important time of year for me, I woke up and I found an email from my payment processor saying that they were going to terminate my account with them because apparently making fantasy football spreadsheets and draft guides is way too close to online gambling, which goes against their terms and conditions. It violates whatever their rules are of vendors that they will support. So I spent the entire day, the other day, migrating the majority of the business that I do on my website, basementbroodff.com, and moving that over to Patreon. So now, moving forward, if you're at any point interested in joining Basement Brood Fantasy Football, joining our amazing community, joining our family, all of that, everything that I do is over on Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Patreon, as opposed to Basement Brood Fantasy Football's website. We have our Discord server, which is an online community. It's an online army of 175 plus other fantasy football players helping each other dominate the fantasy football season. It's also where I spend 100% of my time hanging out 24/7, 365. It's where I share exclusive insights, golden fantasy football nuggets, the very, very second I find them. So if you want to come hang out with me, come hang out with us, all you got to do is go over to Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Patreon channel, which we'll leave a link for you in the show notes below. It's also where in my shop over on Patreon, I put the 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, which is what you've been looking at in today's episode. I also put the link for my 2024 heat maps, which I'm sure to bust out and show you in this episode. My heat maps are contextual analysis for every single player in every single game, every single week, helping you conquer even the most impossible start-sit decisions and set optimal lineups. It's the tool that started this entire business after it went viral a little bit over on Reddit. The links for all of that is down in the show notes below. If you want to join the Basement Brood Fantasy Football family at any point, it's all 100% over on our Patreon channel. We'll see you over there. People forget that Jalen Waddle is just 1 year removed from being fantasy football's wide receiver 8, despite his quarterback suffering traumatic brain injuries for the majority of the 2022 season. Last year was a little bit of a wash because he dealt with injuries of his own, but all signs are pointing to a massive bounce-back season for Jalen Waddle. Thrilled to get him as our first wide receiver, and again, the plan isn't even for him to be our wide receiver 1. If we play our cards right and if things break the right way, Jalen Waddle is going to be our wide receiver 3 behind Cooper Kupp and Deebo Samuel. So everything is currently going according to plan. After I took Jalen Waddle, it went Brandon Ayuk, Josh Jacobs, Trey McBride, Isaiah Pacheco, who, by the way, is teed up for an awesome big-time year. Isaiah Pacheco, he needs to be on your radar. Mike Evans and Mark Andrews. And we are back on the clock with the 4th pick in the 5th round, which makes this pick 44. Now, again, the best player available in my draft guide is Cooper Kupp. And by the way, if you're listening to me say these names and you're wondering at any point, why does he have this player ranked there? Why is he high on this player? Why is he low on this player? Inside of my 2024 draft guide, if you just click enter or double click on a player's name, you're going to get my analysis, my notes, my preview for what to expect from that player in 2024 fantasy football. I've done this for 250 plus players. So it's all right there if you have questions. Again, I won't spend too much time here. You know the plan. We want to try and walk out of here with Cooper Kupp and Deebo Samuel. Now, Cooper Kupp is ranked ahead of Deebo Samuel. He's in a tier ahead of Deebo Samuel, so he's definitely the priority. And when you look at Sleeper's ADP, you can see that these guys are literally 0.1 spots apart, with Deebo Samuel being on top. So I'm not going to take the chance. If I have to choose one, I want to walk out of here with Cooper Kupp over Deebo Samuel. So I'm going to take Kupp here and hope that Deebo Samuel comes back to me on the way back. And again, the whole plan of this is for Jalen Waddle to be my number 3 wide receiver, not my number 1, which is where we took him. But this, when you pay attention to Sleeper's ADP, this is why it's critical, why it's important for you to pay attention to numbers like that instead of just blindly following a top-to-bottom list. There's a lot of fantasy football players that print out a cheat sheet or a list of rankings and they just go top to bottom, leaving tons and tons and tons of value on the table. This is how you maximize the value that you extract out of every single pick. So let's grab Cooper Kupp and let's hope we see Deebo Samuel when it comes back. We swung for the fences and we hit a triple. Nothing wrong with that. I'll take that. Deebo Samuel did not make it back. He went off the board about 5 or 6 picks after I took Cooper Kupp. So we are back on the clock with the 7th pick in the 6th round, which is pick 57 overall. Now, in the best remaining tier in my draft guide, we're looking at 3 wide receivers: Nico Collins, DK Metcalf, DJ Moore. Now, tiebreaker scenarios, there's a reason that I rank these players. It makes it easy to just kind of go top to bottom when you just can't choose between these guys. Now, there's question marks around all 3 of them, and candidly, I tend to be lower than consensus on Nico Collins in 2024 fantasy football. But this is still a guy that in the preseason has been playing full-time snaps with CJ Stroud, one of the brightest, best young quarterbacks in all of football, one of the most exciting offenses that we're expecting to see in 2024. I do expect Nico Collins to be a little bit more boom bust than I would like in 2024 fantasy football as CJ Stroud focuses on feeding several mouths. He's got not just Nico Collins, but Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell and Dalton Schultz and Noah Brown, Joe Mixon. Like there's so many people that deserve the football in that offense, but still, Nico Collins is one of those guys. Nico Collins is a guy who should have his fair share of pretty big weeks. We're going to keep this one simple. This is a guy that usually goes in around the second or third round turn in a 12-team best ball draft on competitive best ball leagues, and here we are going to get him as our third wide receiver in the 6th round. Even if I don't like him as much as consensus, I'm still more than happy to get him at this price. This is a great price to pay for Nico Collins in this draft. Whoops. Might help if I shared my screen with you. Sorry about that if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on podcast, doesn't matter. You can't see my screen anyway. But we're back, and we are on the 4th pick in the 7th round, which is pick number 64. And as you can see on my draft guide, we are still swimming in a sea of wide receivers. In fact, in the best remaining tier on my draft guide, tier 7, we're looking at 5 straight wide receivers: Amari Cooper, T. Higgins, Zay Flowers, Tank Dell, and George Pickens. Now, Amari Cooper, T. Higgins, and Zay Flowers, all 3 of those guys tend to go in the 4th round of competitive 12-team best ball drafts, and we're looking at these guys in the 7th round. Again, Superflex is a little bit of a different animal, but still, we're looking at really good value on all 3 of these guys. Now, candidly, this is a bit of a coin flip. It's one of those things where, because they're in the same tier, you can almost look at them as if they're the same guy or the same value. And part of the beauty of using this draft guide is this is my tier. These 5 guys are in my tier, but you might have one of these 5 that are standing out to you, and you might be saying, yeah, I really want George Pickens, Tank Dell, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, Amari Cooper. For me, I have a lot of T. Higgins in my portfolio. If you listen to my Cincinnati Bengals episode, you'll know that I'm very high on T. Higgins. I think he's undervalued in 2024 fantasy football drafts, and of course you can always come to the draft guide and read what I've written about him in the analysis section. But I also lately have been placing a concentrated effort on getting more Amari Cooper into my portfolio, as I don't feel like I have enough of him. So in this case, just for poops and giggles, I will take Amari Cooper, but I am more than happy, more than fine with you guys taking any of these wide receivers. Slight lean towards Amari Cooper, T. Higgins, and Zay Flowers ahead of Tank Dell and George Pickens, but I'm fine with any of those. Let's grab Cooper as our number 4 wide receiver. And now we have Patrick Mahomes, QB1, Dak Prescott, QB2. We got Jonathan Taylor, who's a stud, hanging on to that RB1 spot. And then at wide receiver, man, we got Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, Nico Collins, and now Amari Cooper. This thing is looking beastie. Want to compete against me in a fantasy football league where you can win up to $50,000? Is that nope, not a typo. That is, you heard me correctly, $50,000. I'm partnering up with Full-Time Fantasy and Circa, and I am hosting the Fantasy Football Championships. It's a 12-team PPR redraft league with up to $2,500 worth of prizes in our 12-team league alone. But the top 4 scorers from our 12-team league automatically advance to Circa's grand prize round, where there's $75,000 worth of prizes, including a $50,000 cash prize for the grand prize winner in the grand prize round. It costs $349 to play, and I am taking the next 7 participants on a first-come, first-served basis. The league is almost about halfway full, and I'm looking for the next 7. So come play fantasy football with me using the link that we left for you in the show notes. All right, we are back on the clock with the 7th pick in the 8th round, which makes this pick number 77 overall. And when I tell you in recent episodes and in this episode that the fantasy football landscape in 2024 shapes up as one where it's really easy to hammer wide receiver early and stock up on running backs late, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We already have on our roster Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, Nico Collins, and Amari Cooper as our 4 wide receivers, which is going to be really hard for any of these other teams to beat. We also have Jonathan Taylor locking down our RB1 spot, meaning we only need to find one more running back, and we need to find that running back every week. Now we're entering an absolute sea of running backs, where we're going to start seeing guys like James Conner, David Montgomery, Aaron Jones, Ramondre Stevenson, Zamir White, Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren, and then some. So we're talking about quality RB2s that you can plug and play, toss right into your lineup depending on their matchup, some of which have clear-cut RB1 upside. Think about a guy like David Montgomery if something were to happen to Jahmyr Gibbs. So, because we're already strong at quarterback, we're already strong at wide receiver, we have a stud number 1 running back, and now we're swimming in a sea of running backs. We're going to try and grab 2 of these guys. And once again, we're going to play the ADP game and swing for the fences. James Conner is the best available running back in this tier. But you'll see if you look at Sleeper's ADP that there's a chance I'll be able to scoop him up in the 9th round. Meanwhile, the number 2 player, the number 2 running back in my list is David Montgomery, and he has a higher ADP on Sleeper than James Conner does, making it at least a little bit more likely that I can take David Montgomery here and get James Conner later than it would be if I were to go James Conner first and David Montgomery later. So the plan here is to get David Montgomery and hope we get James Conner on the way back, and even if we don't, we can possibly get Aaron Jones, Ramondre Stevenson, or one of those other guys that we listed. So the idea with taking a guy like David Montgomery, by the way, is that he carries standalone flex value as a running back in fantasy football, regardless of Jahmyr Gibbs' health. But if anything were to happen to Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery becomes an instant higher-end RB2, arguably a RB1, and a high-end RB2 with RB1 upside. That's exactly the type of player, that's exactly the type of profile that you want to target later in drafts if you do go wide receiver heavy, because that's how you swing for the fences. That's how you maximize upside. Imagine having the best wide receiver room in your fantasy football league, and now you have David Montgomery on a day where Jahmyr Gibbs goes down. And suddenly, you have an RB1 in David Montgomery to pair with your league best wide receiver room. That's why you want a guy like that. Now, we're back on the clock with the 4th pick in the 9th round. That makes this pick, I forgot to update this to 84. This is pick 84. Now, James Conner did not make it back. Neither did Aaron Jones or Ramondre Stevenson, leaving Najee Harris, which is a perfectly fine consolation prize if I can get the RB1 in an Arthur Smith offense, which is notoriously one of the most archaic, one of the most run-heavy offenses in all of football. But from a fantasy football standpoint, if you get the running back in that system, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So we're going to scoop up Najee Harris here, and then every week for the RB2 spot on our team, right? We know Jonathan Taylor is going to be locked in as our RB1, but every week we're going to have a decision to make at RB2. Do we want to go with David Montgomery, or do we want to go with Najee Harris? And in those situations, myself and my subscribers, Basement Brood Fantasy Football subscribers, they are using my weekly heat map. This is a resource that I put together every single week for my subscribers that offers contextual analysis for every single player in every single game, every single week, to help you conquer the most impossible start-sit decisions and dominate the week. Now, over on the left side of the heat map, you're going to see all the team and game information for every team and every game that week. You're going to have their over-unders, which are color-coded, green for high-scoring games and red for low-scoring games, to give you an idea of which games are going to feature plenty of touchdowns and which games won't. Which games will be defensive slugfests that really don't offer a ton of fantasy football points. You're going to see the spread, which again is color-coded in green to show you which teams are favored to win, and red to show you which teams are expected to lose and possibly lose by a lot. So in this case, Packers 49ers, the Packers were 10-point underdogs in that game, which means we can expect the Packers to be trailing in the second half, likely throwing the ball as much as they possibly can in an effort to keep up with the San Francisco 49ers. Meanwhile, the 49ers being 10-point home favorites, they're likely to be running the ball plenty in the second half as they try and kill the clock and move on to the next week. It's going to show you each team's implied point total for that week. Again, color-coded in green to show you the highest scoring teams that week, the projected highest scoring teams. And it's going to show you the red, which is the projected low scoring teams of that week. So in other words, if the 49ers are expected to score over 30 points in that week, you know there's going to be fantasy football points galore. You typically want to get the 49ers into your lineup. Whereas if the Texans are expected to score just 17 points in their game, that might be a week where you consider keeping some of your Texans on the bench. Last but not least, underneath the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end columns, you're going to see a color-coded number that reflects that team's defense and how they perform against that position. So for example, next to the Ravens, underneath quarterback, you're going to see the number 30, which means they are holding enemy quarterbacks to the third fewest fantasy points per game. Quarterbacks are scoring the 30th most fantasy points per game against the Ravens. Meanwhile, the Texans, if you look under the tight end column, you'll see a number 3 for them in this example, meaning the Texans are allowing the third most PPR points per game to opposing tight ends. It's a quick and easy cheat sheet. It's a quick and easy reference guide to help you understand which defenses are strong or weak against which positions. And then over on the right side of the heat map, every single player in every game that week is listed in one of 5 columns. They are either in column A, the blue column, which is a column where all of the data suggests a monster explosion week is coming for that player, or they're placed in column B, the green column, which suggests all the data is pretty good. We should expect an above average performance from that player in their upcoming game. Or they're placed in the C column, the yellow column, which is exactly what it's labeled. Meh. There's nothing that's particularly exciting or nothing that's particularly daunting about the data and the projection for that player's matchup in that week. And then there's the column D column, the orange column, which is where they feel gross. This is a column where all of the data suggests, you know what, this game might be a little bit of a struggle for that player. If there's a week to keep him on the bench, this might be the one. And of course, the last remaining column, the F column, which you can read what it's titled, the red column. These are players that you quite literally shouldn't even be considering for your lineup. I do this for every single player in every single game, every single week. So during the season, when there's 16 games in a week, there are over 250 players in these columns. And when you're faced with these difficult decisions, like trying to decide between David Montgomery or Najee Harris for that RB2 spot, all you have to do is click on any player's name in the heat map or press enter on it. And just like you saw in the draft guide, it's going to tell you what to expect from that player in that game. So in our example, current example, where every week we're probably going to be trying to decide between David Montgomery and Najee Harris, all you would do when faced with those impossible dilemmas is come into the heat map, find that player, click on their name, read the analysis, and make your decision. So in this case, Najee Harris isn't even in this example of the heat map because I grabbed last year's divisional round as my sample. The Steelers weren't in the divisional round, they didn't play, but the Lions did. So you would look at Najee Harris and then you would come look at David Montgomery. He was in the yellow column for this particular game, the meh column. And when you click open his name, it's going to tell you 2 things. It's going to tell you A, what to expect from the Detroit Lions offense in that game. How does the game set up for them? Are they expected to win, lose, score a lot, score a little, win by a lot, lose by a lot? What to expect from the Detroit Lions offense and how volume might shake out for their players. Then, as you scroll down, you're going to see what to expect from David Montgomery. It's going to tell you how David Montgomery has been trending during a specific period of time. Is he on the verge of overtaking Jahmyr Gibbs as the team's RB1? Is he on the verge of falling further and further behind Jahmyr Gibbs? Is he losing playing time? Keep scrolling down. It's going to tell you how his opponent is performing against running backs. In this case, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. How have they been performing against other teams' running backs? How, in which direction have they been trending? And most importantly, how are the Buccaneers performing against running backs that are similar to David Montgomery, including David Montgomery himself. Again, this is the resource that started this entire business after it went somewhat viral on Reddit. This is a resource that 300 plus BBFF subscribers are referencing every single week when they're trying to conquer those impossible start-sit dilemmas, when they're setting their DFS lineups, and frankly, when they're looking for appetizing prop bets to take advantage of during the week and during the season. Again, you can gain access to every single heat map that I do this year. I do it from week 1 all the way through the Super Bowl, excluding week 18 and of course the Pro Bowl. But you can gain access using the link that we left for you in the show notes, which is going to take you right over to Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Patreon. All right, we are officially back on the clock with the 7th pick, 10th round. That makes this pick number 97. Now, the best player available in the best remaining tier on my fantasy football draft guide is Mr. Christian Watson, who I do think is undervalued, underdrafted, and underrated in 2024 fantasy football drafts. Now, that said, once again, we're going to play the sleeper ADP game. Christian Watson is way down here. Christian Watson doesn't go on sleeper until about pick 118. And again, we're on pick 97. We're also going to be coming up soon on a pretty similarly valued batch of question mark flex style running backs. Think about the Bengals backfield with Zach Moss, Chase Brown. Think about guys like Javonte Williams, who's been a big question mark. Think about Tyjae Spears, the Washington Commanders backfield with Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler. Lots of question marks that do have some upside, that do have some flex value, that do have RB2 upside. We're going to have an opportunity to get multiple of those. What we don't have yet is a tight end. And I mentioned earlier in this episode that being a 10-team league, tight end is going to be a much easier position to fill, or at least stream, once again, using the weekly heat map. I literally have a tab in the heat map called Streamers, which is where I put defenses, kickers, and usually, in a non-playoff week, I will have quarterbacks and tight ends, where I can help you identify some of those easy plug-and-play guys that you grab off the waivers, throw into your lineup. Now, all of that being said, the way that this draft has shaken out, we are currently in a sea of wide receivers, the best being Christian Watson, and then a batch of perfectly fine options, but not guys who are going to find my starting lineup very frequently, given the wide receivers that I already have. You'll see that one position is different than the rest over the next, 10 players, and that position is tight end. You'll see that Jake, because we know we're not yet taking Christian Watson, knowing we can wait on him and try and get him later, you dig into that next tier in the draft guide, which is tier 10. It's 4 wide receivers and 1 tight end, which is Jake Ferguson. Now, Jake Ferguson last year was the number 2 receiving option on a team that led the entire NFL in scoring. And when it comes to the final line of tight ends that I would consider drafting because they can be my every week tight end 1, Jake Ferguson is in that group. He is one of those guys. And in this case, it feels like a very easy pick where the whole puzzle is all but complete, but one little piece being tight end. And there it is. Fell right into our lap with Jake Ferguson. Now again, I'm going to take Ferguson here. But if it hadn't shaken out this way, let's say Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice, some of these other guys were still available and somebody had instead taken Ferguson off the board, I wouldn't go reaching for David Njoku or TJ Hawkinson or any of the next tight ends. Instead, I would be using that draft pick on another running back, another wide receiver, and I would just be planning on streaming the tight end position from here on out, but it didn't shake out that way. Jake Ferguson fell into our laps. He's going to complete that starting lineup puzzle, and we're going to keep this thing moving. All right, we are now back on the clock with pick number 104 overall. And again, Christian Watson remains the best player available in my draft guide. He's in a tier all of his own. He's clearly the best player available. However, once again, you look at Sleeper's ADP, there's a very, very strong chance we can get him in the 12th round. So we're going to skip on Christian Watson. We're going to roll the dice, hope we see him in the next round. Now, the next 3 players on the next tier are also all wide receivers. Brian Thomas, Jamison Williams, Keon Coleman. Now, Brian Thomas is a guy who's flying up my draft boards. I'm loving what I'm seeing from him in the preseason. However, given the draft capital that we have already spent at wide receiver, we know Jalen Waddle is going to be in our lineup every week. We know Cooper Kupp is going to be in our lineup every week. We know Nico Collins is likely going to be in our lineup every week. And we know Amari Cooper is more than likely going to be in our lineup every week. Meaning, if I spent a draft pick here on Brian Thomas, Jameson Williams, or Keon Coleman, I will likely be just waiting for bye weeks to put those guys into my lineup. Now, I am more than fine with somebody taking one of these wide receivers. However, I also know that with my next pick, I am trying to get a wide receiver in Christian Watson. So for me, knowing that I am going to need to make a decision at RB2 every single week, I am going to dip back into the running back pool and just grab one of this massive batch of Zach Moss, Chase Brown, Tyjae Spears, Javonte Williams, Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler. Again, these guys are all in the same tier for a reason. They're very similar valued players. Now, typically in coin toss tiebreaker scenarios like this one, where you're basically just trying to choose one of 6 different options, I want to think about swinging for the fences. How can I maximize the best possible upside? And when you think about the NFL offenses that we're about to invest in, we can choose either the Washington Commanders, the Broncos, the Tennessee Titans, all 3 of which are going to be likely to be below average offenses in the NFL, or we can invest in the Cincinnati Bengals backfield, which is going to be one of the best offenses in the NFL. Now, there's no clear-cut RB1. For a long time, we expected Zach Moss to be the RB1 in Cincinnati, but Chase Brown has been flying up ADP. There's a lot of people that seem to think Chase Brown is going to be the Bengals running back to roster by the end of the year, and that very well could be the case, or perhaps even sooner than the end of the year. However, heading towards week 1, Zach Moss is the most likely bet to function as the team's RB1, and if anything were to ever happen to Chase Brown, suddenly Zach Moss is basically on his own as the RB1, as the quote-unquote workhorse for the Cincinnati Bengals. Yes, it could go exactly the opposite way. Zach Moss could go down and Chase Brown could be the workhorse. But as of right now, we want to go with the guy who is expected to get the majority of the volume out of the gate, which is Zach Moss. And he has that upside should anything happen to Chase Brown, putting Zach Moss into a high volume role in a high powered offense, or at least an offense that's typically more exciting, more valuable in fantasy football than the Tennessee Titans, the Denver Broncos, and Washington Commanders. One last thing to mention on that. If Zach Moss is the main guy coming out of the gate and Chase Brown does not get enough volume in week 1, in week 2, in week 3 to pay fantasy football dividends, in a 10-team league with shallow rosters, with only 15 roster spots, there's a possibility that the league manager that ends up with Chase Brown gets impatient, gets frustrated, and drops Chase Brown. So even if we take Zach Moss here, there's no saying we won't get Chase Brown on our roster off of waivers after 3, 4, 5 weeks have passed. So we're going to go with Zach Moss here. Back on the clock with the 7th pick in the 12th round, which makes this pick number 117 overall. Now, the target was Christian Watson. However, he did not make it back. He was picked with the last pick of the 11th round. So, the decision that we have to make here is staying inside of our currently best available tier in our draft guide, which is tier 10. 2 options there between Brian Thomas and Jameson Williams. Now, we've already talked a little bit about Brian Thomas and to an extent Jameson Williams in our last pick. We talked about both of those guys are nice. They're nice options, but more than likely they're going to be on our bench the majority of the season because of the investments that we've already made at wide receiver. However, when we were making that pick, there was a bevy of running backs to choose from, and we know that running back, at least the RB2 spot, is our weakest spot on our roster. So we wanted to have more options to be able to refer to the heat map and choose from every single week. In this case, at this pick, the next best available running backs are Chase Brown, who we just skipped on to take Zach Moss, and you do not want to take both of these running backs. If you're taking 2 running backs from the same backfield, you are capping your own upside. Think about it. Every time Zach Moss gets the football, Chase Brown does not get the football. So unless you're investing in one of those rare, high-powered backfields or an offense that you know is going to be in the top 5 of running back touches, you typically don't want to take 2 running backs from the same backfield. Again, unless you're getting the Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram type of backfield. And even then, you're capping your own upside because every single time that one running back touches the ball, the other one does not. And you're not going to have both of them in your lineup. And if you do, that's on you because you're capping your own upside. So Chase Brown is not going to be an option for us. Somebody else is going to be taking Chase Brown. The next one after that is Brian Robinson, who I do like, who is climbing up my rankings after what I've seen from the Washington Commanders' approach in the preseason so far. But if you look at Sleeper's ADP, there's a pretty decent chance that Brian Robinson is going to come back to us with our next pick. So this is one of those scenarios where I'm going to stay in the best available tier because we're not just going to go into the season with just 4 wide receivers. Of course not. Brian Thomas is a guy that's climbing up my rankings. He seems like he's going to be playing 100% of the snaps. I shouldn't say 100% of the snaps. He'll be playing full-time snaps with Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars, which should be a pass-heavy unit, an above-average unit. Brian Thomas is a great guy to stash on our bench for if injuries happen and when bye weeks inevitably start to roll around. He's the best available player on our guide, best available player in the tier, and he's the pick here in round 12. All right, so I went ahead and grabbed Brian Robinson in the 13th round because he was still available, and now we're back on the clock with the 7th pick in the 14th round, which is pick 137, and we are at a spot in this draft where we have 5 wide receivers, 4 of which are really strong. We have 2 really strong quarterbacks. We have a tight end that we feel like we can trust every single week. We're at a spot where it makes sense for us to basically start ignoring wide receivers and just focusing on stockpiling as many running backs as we possibly can, guys that have some standalone flex value and or guys that become instant RB2s in fantasy football if things break right or if the guy ahead of them goes down. Now, the best available running back on my draft guide is currently Rico Dowdle / J.K. Dobbins. I like coming out of drafts with running backs on the Chargers. I want a running back from the Chargers offense with Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman. Greg Roman is an offensive coordinator who's been in the NFL for 10 years, and he's never, ever, ever finished worse than 9th in the NFL in rushing attempts. We know more than anything that the Chargers are going to run the ball as much as they possibly can, and there's no crystal clear answer as to who that is going to be for the Chargers in 2024. Back when Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman worked together with the 49ers, it was very clearly Frank Gore, and Frank Gore balled out with those guys. But in 2024, is it going to be Gus Edwards? Is it going to be J.K. Dobbins? Is it going to be their rookie, Kamani Vidal? Now, Gus Edwards has proven effective as a running back in the past. J.K. Dobbins has the most theoretical upside. He was a dynamic prospect before injuries basically sidelined his entire career. And Kamani Vidal is has been one of my favorite late round picks in best ball leagues. I want to come out of most drafts with at least or with one of those guys. And in this case, Gus Edwards is gone. Dobbins has been climbing up the charts a little bit. We're going to go with J.K. Dobbins here. Remember earlier in this episode when I mentioned that 10-team leagues with only 15 roster spots tend to be shallow or tend to leave pretty massive waiver wire selections and opportunities to plug holes in your roster just with some savvy waiver wire maneuvering? Here's a pretty good example of this. We are in the final round. This is our last pick of the entire draft in a Superflex league, and quarterbacks like Baker Mayfield, Deshaun Watson, Will Levis, Geno Smith, Bryce Young, Derek Carr, Daniel Jones, Bo Nix. There's still a ton of quarterbacks left on the board because this is just a 10-team league and a 15-round draft. So earlier when I mentioned, hey, if I don't get two of those every week starters, I'm okay just waiting and plucking some strong quarterbacks later. Guys like Deshaun Watson in the last round, that's plenty of upside with your final round pick if you didn't land something like Patrick Mahomes and Dak Prescott earlier in the draft. And then beyond quarterback, we're looking at guys like Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel doesn't get out of the 8th round of best ball drafts on competitive best ball leagues. 8th round pick, and here we are looking at him in the 15th round. So by the end of the draft, you're going to have your selection to basically cherry pick any player that you want. Again, I'm going to continue to stock up on running backs that offer standalone value and have bigger upside if things break right or the guy in front of them goes down. And there's so many names on this list that I personally have targeted in so many of my best ball drafts on drafters this summer. Marshawn Lloyd, Jaleel McLaughlin, that's probably going to be the pick here because there's a very good chance that he's way, way, way more active on the Broncos offense than people are expecting. We talked a little bit about Keimani Vidal. It's weird seeing Dameon Pierce this high. He's usually drafted way lower, but he's a very strong end-of-bench stash. Should anything happen to Joe Mixon, he won't be my pick. Ray Davis is a guy that I think is going to come into fantasy football value this season, regardless of how James Cook is doing. The Buffalo Bills didn't spend a higher draft pick on a geriatric rookie just to watch him sit on the bench. Tyrone Tracy has an outside chance to become the Giants' number one running back, especially in PPR leagues, since the guy is a natural-born wide receiver that just recently converted to running back. Khalil Herbert is getting more offensive snaps with Caleb Williams during the preseason than DeAndre Swift is. He arguably should be the first Chicago Bears running back coming off draft boards. Bucky Irving's had a really good preseason. Elijah Mitchell could get cut by the 49ers and end up with a running back needy team. Braylon Allen's been balling with the New York Jets. They're very high on him. Audric Estime could get some run with the Broncos. Will Shipley, Tank Bigsby would be a popular waiver wire pickup if anything happened to him. Jordan Mason looks like he's going to be the handcuff to Christian McCaffrey. There's an endless list of running backs that I would like to have on my roster here, and you can just cherry pick whichever one you want, given the way that the rest of this draft is gone. I'm going to go with Khalil Herbert because he's looking like he's the Bears running back to roster in 2024 fantasy football drafts right now. So, all done. After 15 rounds to recap, we got Patrick Mahomes, who's going to be our QB1 every single week. We got Dak Prescott, who's going to be on our lineup every single week. We really don't even have to think twice about quarterbacks. Come bye weeks, we will either play one of our running backs or wide receivers in the flex, or we're just going to go ahead and grab a guy like Deshaun Watson, who used to look like an MVP candidate back in the day. We got Jonathan Taylor holding down the RB1 spot. We know he's going to be in there every week as long as he's healthy. At RB2, we're going to use the weekly heat map to decide on if we want to go with David Montgomery's matchup, Najee Harris's matchup, Zach Moss's matchup, Brian Robinson, J.K. Dobbins, Khalil Herbert, or any of those options that we left on the waiver wire because this league does have shallow rosters. At wide receiver, we're pretty much locked in, and we know we basically have the best wide receiver room in this 10-team league. We got Jalen Waddle locked in. We got Cooper Kupp locked in. Nico Collins playing with C.J. Stroud. We also got Amari Cooper. And then, as somewhat of a surprise to me, we ended up with an every-week tight end as Jake Ferguson fell into our laps. A very good chance that he's the number 2 receiving option in an offense that finished number 1 in scoring in the NFL last year. Very, very pleased with how this turned out. And Mr. Attababy Eats a Boy, if your roster is looking like this when you walk out of your draft in a few days, you should feel terrific about where you're standing. That's going to be all for today's episode. Really, really hope that you found this helpful. And if you liked what you saw in today's episode, if you liked the looks of the draft guide, if you want to give the heat maps a spin, if you're interested in joining our community and our army over at Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Discord server, then just follow the one link that we left for you in the show notes below that takes you straight over to Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Patreon server, where you're going to find several options and you can choose your meal right then and there. I'll see you on the fantasy football field. Cheers. This brew's for you.